Melissa is a reporter at BuzzFeed News and also an Emerson Fellow at the think tank New America. Her reporting focuses on the intersection of justice, class, and race. In 2017, she authored a landmark investigation detailing how a group of predominantly working-class Latina women from Chicago had uncovered evidence suggesting a police detective had framed at least 51 of their sons, brothers, or husbands. This series has led to the exoneration of 10 men who had spent each decades behind bars. The series has earned her the George Polk Award in Journalism and recognition as a finalist for Harvard's Goldsmith Award. She's now working on a book that examines the cracks in the criminal justice system in the US and the hidden role that women play in correcting injustices. Please, round of applause for Melissa.
Thank you so much for welcoming me here. It's definitely an honor to be here in Germany for the first time as well. So Sam and I are both Berlin neophytes. But as a storyteller, I hope you don't mind if I just tell you a couple stories that I myself have learned in the process of reporting this story that followed, as Michael said, a group of working class Latino women who for decades had fought on behalf of their sons. And you'll see, I think, through the course of this, why the story meant so much to me. And I think, for me personally, it begins on November 10th, 2011. For me, that's the day that the entire trajectory of my life changed forever. And I remember two things most specifically about that day. I remember how hard the bench outside the courtroom where I was sitting felt beneath me. And I also remember how much I wanted to throw up at that particular moment. And I had been a reporter for more than a decade by that time. This was not new to me in any way, sitting outside a courthouse waiting for proceedings to begin. But what was definitely different about that day is it was the first time I was waiting for the court personnel to come out and to call the name of somebody who I loved. And when that court personnel came out, they were calling out for Alfredo Sandoval. But to me, he'd always been just Freddie. I remember when my nephew first came into my life, and he was, my memories of him are him sort of bounding around, sort of these brown matted waves, sort of held down by his hair gel. And I remember him as a kid running around with this Michael Jordan jersey that he refused to take off for like 3, I am not taking this thing off even to sleep days. I don't know if any parents have had that experience where your kid won't take something off. And I also remember most clearly as well that when my brother was telling me about my nephew, I was living away at the time, he said, Freddie comes with a little bit of a warning. And he said he doesn't necessarily have tantrums like most kids do. He has meltdowns. And what I didn't totally understand at that time was my brother was very tactfully trying to distinguish for me the difference sort of between a paper cut and a stab wound. I mean, both are painful, both can cut, but really only the latter will kill you. And I didn't totally understand that at the time, nor did I understand that when I would come home on vacations from college or from work, that Freddie and we'd play hide and seek, and I didn't know that, us counting to 10, because he only spoke Spanish at the time. I didn't know at that particular time also that these games, like these quiet games, which he has never ever won against me in this, even to this day. And I didn't know that sort of this mutual love that we have of baseball would sort of form this bond between us that would last, well beyond time, distance, and I'd argue even reason at various points in my life. And then one day, as years pass, my nephew's meltdowns didn't really improve in any way. They were actually just more difficult because he was older, and the consequences, of course, were more profound. And these meltdowns started fraying the edges of my brother's marriage. And one Thanksgiving, I'm at home, and I go to the restroom, and in that time, my soon-to-be ex-sister-in-law puts my nephew in the back of a car and drives away and moves that family to Texas. This was a nephew with whom I'd had a profound and deep connection, and I never even had the chance to say goodbye to him. I had tried, of course, as soon as he was old enough to get a cell phone and to communicate with him, but every text message that I sent was basically met with absolutely nothing. But yet I still tried.
And finally, one day, in April of 2011, he did respond. And through the years, I had sort of stopped. I was a Major League Baseball reporter long before this. I know it's sort of a transition to investigative journalism. But I would stop by and I would buy all these commemorative bats and pins and all sorts of Major League regalia that I always bought for him, and I would just save them. And I texted him, I think, offering up some of this to him at that particular time. And this day he actually did respond. And he told me, just sort of in this long, rambling text message, how, he was 17 at that time, he dropped out of school, he'd gotten his girlfriend pregnant, and he was, quote, and I remember this phrasing very clearly, slanging rock. And I was so completely naive that I thought that maybe he'd taken a job as a mason somewhere. When I went to urbandictionary.com, thank God for that site, I found out that, of course, that's not what it meant at all. And I was going through and I was texting him. I was like, Freddie, you can't sell drugs. I was ticking off every sort of bad crime American show that I'd ever seen. And I said, you're going to end up arrested. And he says, well, you're going to end up in jail. And he says, well, I've already been there. And I sort of pecked back on my keyboard. And I'm like, well, as a reporter, I knew if he'd been arrested, there probably were some subsequent hearing. And he said, no, nothing happened. And as a reporter, I know that in the American criminal justice system, nothing never happens. So I, again, ply my trade as a sports reporter, but I still apply those same sort of questioning skills. And I go to the courthouse in San Antonio, Texas, where he lived. I pull up the files and find out that my nephew, in what probably 20 years ago would have been a house party fight, was now facing 20 years for a trumped-up charge of robbery. But in the course of this, I also did some more investigation. I used those same reporting skills and found out that there was absolutely no way he committed this crime, this quote-unquote crime, I should say. And so that's how I found myself, back on November 10th, 2011, sitting outside that courtroom, ready to vomit, because I knew that my nephew was innocent. But I also knew at the very same time I was sort of dealing with my own crisis. And that's that the very same reporting skills that I was depending on to exonerate my nephew were also the very same skills that I was going to be fired for in a matter of months as a journalist. Of course, we all know that it's not exactly the most stable industry. And every single day I was hearing at work that the very same skills that I was going to be depending on to save my nephew's life were the same skills I was being told over and over and over again weren't good enough for a sports magazine. So I was sort of dealing with my own personal issues of sort of like my own imprisonment, whether it be like of shame and self-doubt and those kind of issues. And so that's sort of what brings me to this point. And I'm sure like now y'all are wondering like if you walked into the wrong room, if this is like an Oprah Super Soul Sunday conversation or some sort of self-help talk or something like that, but it's not. Because what I can tell you is that through this, my experience with Freddie, it sort of brought me to a profound place of brokenness. And that brokenness is exactly what has taught me how to be a reporter able to do high impact work. What I learned through this whole entire experience is that it's not enough, I think, to be able to simply expose pain, as we do as journalists, if you don't connect to it. And the only way that I know how to connect to sort of divide, to sort of erase that line between us and them, between the readers who are privileged and the subjects who might not be so, is I think through that brokenness, through that shared humanity. And the only way that I know how to get to that shared humanity is through that particular brokenness. And I applied that when in 2015, I was out of work at Sports Illustrated, where I had been, spent most of my career. Didn't know exactly what I was gonna do, so like any good American, I thought I'd go to law school. So after that, but I needed a job, I needed health insurance, I needed, a steady paycheck because I was still paying off the loan that I had taken to find legal representation for my nephew. So I needed something, and I happened to be scrolling through Twitter, and it actually was not a whole repository of awfulness that it generally is, because I actually found a job posting, and it was a one-year offer to work at BuzzFeed News. It was an investigative fellowship, and I said, okay, well, I remember during my sports reporting, I had come across a story of a man, of a lawyer out of San Diego, California, who for the past 20 years had been traveling on his own time and on his own dime to Chicago, Illinois, where he had been representing the same woman. And I thought, what in the world would drive somebody to do something for 20 years? And that was the question, and it's because he was so profoundly convinced of her innocence that he had to make sure that she was free. And so when I saw this job opening, I thought, okay, well, I can write about that, without any single idea that as soon, and I wish that this were some great feat of investigative journalism, but it wasn't. I popped this particular detective in this woman's case into Google, and I saw these old message boards from like union websites and from sort of like these marginalized, like the plumbers union, I think, had something saying, hey, my nephew was caught up in something, or my son was framed by the same detective. And so I started to pause, right? You hear it once, okay, you hear it twice, but suddenly, as I was going through the Google results, I was seeing maybe 3 times. So I end up on a plane. I end up, I think, packing for 4 days to go to Chicago, and instead end up moving there for 6 months. And I'm reporting this story. And again, I'm not very confident in my own abilities, given like sort of the terrible breakup, to which I'm not allowed to say because of a non-disclosure agreement with my previous job. I was shaky. I wasn't exactly sure what I was supposed to do. And I will tell you, that was probably one of the greatest things that ever happened to me. Because instead of being so confident, instead of being so sure that I knew every single question that I was supposed to ask, and that I was not only sure what question I was going to ask, but I was sure what answer I would get, right? Because I was so prepared that I went in and I'm like, look, I'm going to listen. I'm not showing up here to talk to you. I'm showing up here at these doorsteps of these humble and sort of disenfranchised folks to listen. And I think that that was one of the keys for me in being able to bring about and to discover this story, is not to find 3 cases, but I ended up sitting, I think, in one of my very first interviews, and I had no idea that there was a whole cadre of women who had gotten together when I was still in elementary school and had already started investigating and discovering. And this case was their work was so old that they were producing spreadsheets way before Excel. They were doing it on Lotus, which I didn't even know about until I had to start doing this story. I didn't even know that there was a program like that. They had everything. And it's just because somebody happened to tell me. It's not because I knew that this story was about this. When I walked in, I thought the story perhaps was about this detective, when in reality, just by shutting up as a reporter, I ended up learning that the story was very much about these women and about their amazing, courageous, and brave fight for their loved ones for the past 20 years. And so in the course of that takes me, I'm not a big slide person, but this is like sort of what we used. It ends up being about sort of a lot of these women you see up here are women who have, so much so that it's generational at this point, as you see some younger faces in there. But the women in the top 2 sort of left-hand corner are 2 aunts who I end up profiling in the main piece, who took their nephew, and of course this was a familiar pain to me. The second one ends up moving into her father's unfinished basement in Chicago, where it's very cold. She leaves her apartment so that she's able to give all of her money to her nephew's legal fees after he's accused of a double homicide. She knows that he's innocent because the woman to her left, her sister Mary, is at home with their nephew the night that this particular crime happens. So, and then you see sort of you'll see like a younger woman there. She's the second one in from the left. Her mother is one of the ones who founded this particular group. Like, that's how long this story had been out there. And I think for me, one of the things that I learned is that by just sitting down and listening to what was happening in this community, I discovered a story that had been there for the taking for more than 20 years. And so I think that that's really one of the powers of sometimes very basically, I know that this is sometimes it's almost too obvious, but I think really does bear repeating, that sometimes your only job is to show up and listen. The second thing that I sort of learned from being like a train wreck when I was reporting this, and it starts to feel, I think, a little bit more like the ghosts on A Christmas Carol, right? Where like these folks like show up and start like teaching you these various things. I think in many ways that's what this gentleman, Antonio McDowell, was to me. In many ways, I learned from him that it's very possible that despite my education and my opportunity and all my advantages, that this man behind me, who was arrested at age 19 and is serving a 110-year sentence for a murder that he most likely did not commit, had way more information and had way more ability to tell me how to do my job than I would have even thought. So it starts with Antonio, where one day I walk in and he's been charged with this murder in which he's accused of walking into a room, into a garage, a couple of days before Christmas and murdering a young father, then rifling through his pockets. This happens in a neighborhood that's clearly across town from where he lives. The only thing that we know about the killer is that he was wearing a Nike hat, according to witness statements, and a green t-shirt. That's the only information that we know about this particular case. It is assigned to the detective who is at the heart of this story, who's been accused of framing more than 50 people for murders they don't commit, and we count Antonio as one of them. I was very proud by this point. I had gone through a couple of cases, I had done a lot of reporting, and I thought I knew everything about his case cold. I'm feeling a little bit more confident by this point, and he's telling me, he says, I ask him what I thought was actually the most basic question when I walk in, like with my files nice and organized, everything ready to go, and I say, Antonio, can you please tell me why you're innocent? And he looks at me and goes, innocent? And I swear, he rolled his eyes like I was the dumbest person who ever walked the face of the earth, right? And he tells me, no, that's not how you do this. That's not how you do this at all. The only way you're going to know I am innocent is if you do everything in your power to prove that I'm guilty, because you can't. And that is like a mindset and a methodology that I applied to every single case I evaluated from there on out. And I will tell you that it saved my ass a few times, because there were a few people who were, pretending they're innocent, and it wasn't true. And by using this particular, approach that he had taught me, he ended up saving me from looking like a fool in several instances. So I think as journalists, sometimes we're so hardwired to be in control of the situation that we don't necessarily listen to our sources and know that they might be able to show us a new path to the truth. So that was probably one of the second biggest lesson that I learned along the way. The next sort of shows up to me in the form of a struggling heroin addict by the name of Francisco Vicente. Mr. Vicente was 19 years old, and again had a record for petty theft, like we see with a lot of folks who are struggling with addiction. But yet, this detective at the heart of this case ends up taking Mr. Vicente, throwing him in a room, and if you believe Mr. Vicente's story, he is beaten until he gives that he gives false witness, not in one, not in two, but in 3 separate murder investigations. He ends up lying, giving sworn statements that he says are absolutely not true. Those statements end up sending 5 different men to prison for over 200 years. Now, Mr. Vicente, I have been chasing this guy down for years. Literally, it took me 3 years to be able to find him. I pull up to this pizzeria on the outside of Chicago where I know that he works. I'm waiting for him by this dumpster. It is so glamorous, I can't even tell you, for him to be able to walk out. And the first time I approach him, I introduce myself, hi, I'm Melissa. And I remember his words exactly to me, and it was, fuck off, bitch, leave me alone. And the problem is, as journalists, we've heard way worse than that, right? So no, of course I didn't do that. Instead, what I did is I fostered relationships with, say, the mother of his child. His cousins, his brothers, all became like guests at my Thanksgiving table, right? Because I needed them to be able to trust me in order to engender the trust that he needed to have in me. And so after 3 years of this, Francisco finally sits down with me. And one of the first things that I learned from him, and I know it's very difficult because so many of us are under such time constraints these days and we don't have the luxury of time, but one of the first, I think, and most important lessons that I've learned is, especially when you're dealing with the poor, they don't have PR teams. They don't have any lobbyists who are working for them and pushing their agenda. So in many cases, it's going to be about time. You're dealing with folks who, when you're working on the margins, these are people who have suffered tremendous harm. In many cases, that harm is followed right behind by some serious trauma. And so their stories don't always come out in a linear fashion. They don't come out nice and neat, and in some cases, they contain contradictions that make us as journalists want to tear our hair out. But I think through the process of just giving them time to be able to speak is one of the most incredibly powerful tools that we have, is just sort of empowering people on the margins to be able to tell their story. And I can't tell you how many times, especially with the inmates, that I was the first person who had actually taken the time to listen to them, to actually hear their explanations, and how incredibly empowering that is for your subject matters. The second thing that I learned in this Vicente interview was the ability to sort of cede some of the control. And what that means is I let him set a lot of the interview terms. When he wanted to take a smoke break, he knew that he could take a smoke break. When he needed to be able to sort of gain his composure when he was talking about some of this trauma, he had time to gain his composure. I think the first meeting that I had with him, we sat at a diner for 8 hours because that's how long it took us to be able to sort of get to that level of trust, to be able to get to that place where he could go there and actually tell the stories that I needed him to tell. And then the last thing that I learned, which was very important, and I would never do this, somebody who's powerful, somebody who has some sort of authority or voice, but I think it's very important when I was dealing with any of these story subjects, is to establish some assurances to them. Things don't necessarily always come out as polished as they might like them to be or as true. So it's being able to go back to them and say, hey, this is what we're writing. And I do this because they are the ones who are vulnerable, and they are the ones who are going to have to deal with the consequences of what is published. And in this particular story that I wrote that featured the two aunts that we were looking at earlier, I had no idea what was actually going to be sensitive to them because I don't live their lives. And it was one tiny line about their nephew's mother that ended up being, I think, one of the most difficult parts for them. And I would have never have known that. So being able to go back and say, hey, we're going to, whatever the terms might be, and again, it's not giving them control, to be able to control the story, because that's not what's happening. It's being able to offer them assurances that they are going to know what is happening, that they're not going to be surprised by anything, or that they can't explain to you the potential harm that might come from them sharing your story with them. So those are 3 things that I like to keep in mind, that I specifically learned through Francisco and through his story. And then probably the most important thing is when we're writing about people on the margins, we're writing about people who inherently nobody gives a crap about, right? I mean, that's why they're on the margins. So how in the world was I going to help anybody? How in the world was I going to write the story about a bunch of Latino men, mostly Latino and Black men in Chicago, who had some of them had tattoos and rap sheets that would make you clutch your purse, right? I mean, if you didn't know anything else. And how was I going to make anybody care about people who are virtually invisible? And that's when I really had to do a lot of deep thinking and realize that it's never enough to simply expose harm. You have to connect people to it, right? And the way that I ended up strategically doing this is to realize what separates us from them. And that's that, for a lot of these guys, they weren't these hardened gang members. They were Roberto, who had to iron his pants, with absolute laser-like perfection before he went out anywhere. There was Jose, who was so funny that he puts any comedian to shame. There were all of these people and these characteristics, and there was depth and dimension, and that's who they were to their mothers, right? And so who wouldn't understand a mother being able to do anything and everything, even if it's 20 years, to be able to fight for their loved one, right? That's a journey that I don't care how rich you are, I don't care how poor you are, most likely you can identify with that. So that ended up being the approach that we took for the story. And also because I think, sort of secondarily, it honored their work that they had done. Because for so many years, these women had gone to the authorities, they'd gone to the people who were supposed to protect them. And instead their social status was sort of confused and for their intellect, for their credibility. And I didn't want that to happen in this piece. And even other journalists had sort of dismissed them and waved them off as like crazy tinfoiled, conspiracy theorists. And so when thinking about how do we tell these stories, how do we make people care, I think it's always really, really important to figure out what is universal, what is human about all of these things. And so that's what we did. And when we published this particular story, it was 10 days afterwards that this happened.
So behind me, the family is waiting for Robert Almodovar to be released from prison. He's been in there for 23 years. We just got word that Robert is actually walking out right now. Robert's actually walking out right now.
That's his daughter, who was 6 months old when he was incarcerated.
What do you guys plan on doing?
Play, go to my ass house and eat some Puerto Rican food. We gotta get new ones.
Yeah.
That say freedom.
It's great. It's unbelievable.
Telephone.
Hello? Can you hear
Now you have the rest of your life?
Yes. Yes.
So right after that, I'm in sort of like the background over here, and I'm typing up my notes, for the story that we're going to publish about our story subject's release that day. And the crowd starts to thin. Everybody's starting to go home, to go eat pasteles with Roberto's family. Media goes, I'm still there finishing up my notes, sitting on a curb. And when I'm finally done, I remember on that particular day, which I consider to be sort of the second happiest day of my life, watching him walk free, watching sort of the power of our work unfold like that. I sort of shut my computer and I think back to what was the happiest day of my life. And that was 6 years earlier. And that was the day that I got the phone call that the prosecutors in my own nephew's case were dropping the charges based on the work that we were able to show. And so I pick up my phone and I call my nephew and I explain to him all that's happened and sort of how that sort of trauma of what we went through together has helped and served somebody else and some other family. And I call and I pick him up. When I pick up the phone, I hear in the background he's got, the machinery, which, that's very loud. He works now, as we joke, he legally slangs rock as a trained stonemason. So that's sort of a joke that we now have. And I talk to the man who's sort of become an incredible father, a hardworking man. Everything that I was so terrified that felony record, had he been convicted, had he been in prison, would have ruined. And I pick him up, and I'm telling him this on the phone, what I've just seen. And he tells me, he says, you freed me. And you not only saved me, but you freed him. And for me, I'm like tearing up. This giant lump is in my throat because of, everything that's happened, sort of like our own heartbreak, my own sort of brokenness and not feeling like anybody would want to trust me with their story. And I sit and I think, and I'm like, I might have helped free them, but they had helped free me too. And that's sort of what I've learned working on this story. Thanks.